This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Now, speak for England, Evan, and Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales as well.
Now, it may not feel that super for you, but it's Super Tuesday today, the day that 10 US states hold their Republican primaries or caucuses. Jim Naughtie is over in Washington and set out to me earlier what we should be looking out for.
It is a big day.
Well, a big day for him, but in feedback this week, I'll ask the editor of the BBC Radio Newsroom why he thinks you need to hear so much about the American primaries when the story never changes. Romney is in the lead, but can't clinch the deal. And one feedback listener thinks Radio 2 should park its travel updates, but Sally Traffic says she hasn't reached the end of the road yet.
The traffic news is as vital a public service as the sport, as the finance, as the weather. And I always say you always find traffic news really boring until you're stuck in a jam.
Don't worry, there are no more excruciating puns to come. A vehicle for over-emotional ranters, or a hotline to real life in Britain today. I put listeners' views on the ubiquitous phone-in to 5 Live presenters Victoria Derbyshire and Stephen Nolan. But first, how much detail do you need to hear when it comes to news reports about the atrocities of war or a particularly brutal murder? Opinion among feedback listeners is sharply divided. Take last week's reporting of the horrific events leading up to the death of 15-year-old Christy Bamu, whose sister and her partner believed was a witch. Godfrey Holmes from Chesterfield was one of a number of listeners who thought there was too much detail, especially as a report he heard came with no advance warning. Other listeners were also shocked.
My name is Sandra Carmichael and I live in Broughty Ferry in Dundee. I heard a news item about the young boy who had been tortured by his sister and her partner, and how the court had heard some harrowing details about the torture.
Judge David Paget, QC, acknowledged that this had been a harrowing case, so much so that he exempted the members of the jury from ever having to consider another one.
And I did think to myself at the time, well, I'm very thankful that I didn't have to listen to anything like that. But later on in the news item, we did get a greater level of detail about the torture that he'd been subjected to. And it's this level of detail given in a short news item that I would rather was omitted. It was quite shocking to hear it.
At first he deprived everyone of food, water and sleep, but eventually he began torturing.
My name's Vivian. I'm from Pinner, and I was able to get my child out of the room, and I don't think she heard, but it surprised me that there was no kind of little introduction saying that some aspects of this report are going to be shocking to listeners.
In other news bulletins last week, some reports on both the witchcraft trial and the shelling in Syria were preceded by warnings. Other feedback listeners thought these were unnecessary.
My name is Peter McMurray. I'm phoning from Southampton. Twice the newsreader warned that the following item may be distressing.
The pair killed the boy on Christmas Day in 2010. Our correspondent Richard Lister was at the Old Bailey. Some listeners may find details in his report distressing.
This is a news programme and much of the news is distressing. If it's that bad, don't broadcast it.
Our correspondent Paul Wood has been speaking to a group of refugees from Homs. You may find his report distressing.
My name is Constantine Pagonis and I live in Western Colville near Cambridge. Why a warning at all? What are the reasons behind it? Is it to ensure that people who do not want to be distressed have a chance to turn the radio off? Or is it to give parents a chance to shield children from such reports?
They endured weeks under bombardment, then fled, panicked, before troops arrived.
I would be very interested to understand the advice, legal or otherwise, which underpins this policy. Perhaps a more sensible approach would be simply to recognise that news reports, unfortunately, often contain material that is both distressing for adults and inappropriate for children.
I went to see Richard Clark, the editor of the BBC Radio Newsroom, and started by asking him why he chose to include so much distressing detail about the witchcraft murder trial.
This was an exceptional case. The agencies who were involved in investigating it had told us that it was one of the worst cases of child abuse that had ever come before a British court. And you can't get the gravity of a story over to the listener unless you include some detail.
But isn't it enough to say that a child was tortured in the most appalling way. Why do you have to specify the precise details of the torture?
It is true that we did specify individual acts of violence. What we didn't do, though, was to go into enormous detail about each of those acts of violence. But we did think, to get over the seriousness of the case, you needed to include some of that material.
And how about the case in Syria at the moment, when some of the bombardment by shells is obviously so indiscriminate? How do you decide what detail to give, not just in numbers, but in the nature of the injuries?
Very serious things are happening in Syria. I think all the listeners would agree to that. And I think it would be wrong to sanitise things too much. We stick closely to accounts given to us, not just out of a desire to be accurate, not just out of respect to the people who are giving us those accounts, very often citizens who are caught up in the fighting, but because we're aware that some of the listeners, who may include the Syrian government and their supporters, will question the veracity of what they're hearing. So, therefore, we think we have to stick very closely to what we are being told, and that involves being literal to some extent.
Now, when do you decide to give warnings in this case about what is to follow? Because according to Godfrey Holmes, in the case of the witchcraft story, you didn't, last Thursday on Radio 4, you didn't give a warning.
We did and we didn't. The truth is that on various times in the day we did give warnings. Sometimes they were explicit, so in the 6 o'clock news on Radio 4 we said before the report, some listeners may find the account of the violence in our report disturbing. In other summaries it was implicit, so in one we said during the trial the jury heard highly distressing details.
But Vivian Elliott says, for example, I'm listening to the news at Radio 4 5:15 on Thursday, and the details are so terrible, I'm surprised that we were not warned before the report commenced.
No, it is true that the PM programme did not give a warning.
Should it have done?
Yes, I think so. In my opinion, yes. But, you know, it does divide the audience, this matter, because undoubtedly some people want to be warned, because we're a little bit of an uninvited guest in their kitchens, in their living rooms when they're listening to this sort of material. But some people tune in thinking, I want to be told, and they feel patronised when we do.
Yeah, to be fair, that's that is the case in some of the emails we've got. So how do you make that decision? How do you decide when to give a warning and when not to give a warning?
The reports come in, you listen to it, and you think, wow, that does stand a chance of causing some offence. Is it a key element of the story? Will I not understand the significance, the importance of what is happening if this is left out?
But what about the time of day? I mean, for example, 5 o'clock is a time children are coming home from school, perhaps sitting down having tea with their parents. Would you put a warning at 5 o'clock, or indeed delete some of the detail at 5 o'clock, and yet run it without a warning at 10 with much detail?
Radio doesn't have the watershed the way television does. But our producers do sit down and think about who might be listening at that time. And we do modify the news with that in mind.
Richard Clark, editor of the BBC Radio Newsroom. But we're not finished with him yet. Here is another contentious news-related subject. Yes, it's the American presidential primaries. Missing from the newsroom in London and the Today office this week has been James Naughtie, who, as usual, has flown to the United States to cover the race for the nomination, which he finds absolutely fascinating. Feedback listener Dr. Stephanie Sadler does too. She emailed to say, I know you'll probably get lots of negative comment about too much American election coverage, so can I say I really enjoy it? Yes, you can, Dr. Sadler. And you're right, we have had lots of negative comments. Last week on Feedback, editors from the World Service admitted that their listeners too were heartily sick of news of the US elections. Perhaps it's a good thing that Jim is out of the country. I'm sure he'd be upset by the following emails we received.
My name is Roger Morgan, and I live in Kirkham, Lancashire. How on earth can these primaries possibly be given headline status, since they're only a runoff for the real runoff in November, and for a subject which really is of very little interest for anybody in the UK, and could have easily been covered, say, by Mark Modell, or even in a slot in From Our Correspondence.
I'm Maxine Matthews. I live in Gosden in Surrey, and the point I wanted to make was that I'm bored out of my skull with the coverage of the American presidential election, given that it's not really actually started yet. All this selection of the actual candidate to be seems to be interminable, and it's of no interest to people in this country because we don't know the individuals concerned, we don't know the issues they're talking about, and it'd be much more interesting when they decide who's going to run, and then we can address the actual problems raised during the election campaign.
I'm John Aiken, phoning from Kenilworth in Warwickshire. I think it was forgetting that they are only the primaries at the moment, and some of the people involved are not actually going to make it to the final election. They're not terribly relevant to us at this stage. But now there are far more important things going on in the world, and really the primaries are almost irrelevant.
My name's Chris Padley. I'm from Lincoln. What I find is that everybody I know is in the same boat in this country. They all say the same thing. They've no idea what it's all about. And we're actually not very interested in the sense that we've got better things to do than go and mug up on American election law and election procedures and election histories. We're interested when it comes up to the run-up to the actual election. And, of course, American politics is important to the world. But we just don't understand it, and no one ever explains it. So what's the point in telling us about it?
Richard Clark, as you heard, a lot of our listeners think there is too much about the American primaries. Why is there at the moment so much coverage?
I think it's fair to say this story completely divides the audience. Some people, it irritates them madly. Others, they can't get enough of it. As someone who's been in the BBC quite a long time, trust me, I think we're doing less than we were doing a few years ago, 4 years ago. But, you know, I do think it's a very, very important story. It's a fascinating story. And this week, for example, I think it's important that we're there because it's Super Tuesday, where you have 10 states all voting on the same day. And we are getting closer and closer to the stage where we know who will be standing against President Obama in the elections in November.
All right, that's the reason we're covering it, but it's the scale of the coverage you give it.
There's something important happening in the Republican Party, isn't there? There's the establishment, and there's a ground roots movement, and they are fighting for who controls that party. And that party, more often than not, returns the President of the United States. So I think that is important. But let me just say one other thing, Roger. You know, we don't just exclusively focus on American elections, which I know some of the people who have written in have said is the case. You know, in this last week alone, we've reported on the elections in Russia, in Iran. A few weeks ago, we reported on the elections in Egypt. We are reporting this week on the elections in France, which are coming up. In a few weeks' time, we'll be reporting on elections in Greece.
But I bet you the audience thinks that you've covered the American primaries, not even the election, far more than the potential fate of President Sarkozy in France.
Well, the US presidential election takes about a year, okay? In France, it doesn't take anything like that long. It is starting. We are going to do a lot.
Richard Clark, editor of the BBC Radio Newsroom. Only 8 months to go. Now back to Britain. Perhaps you're listening to this programme in the car. If so, at any moment, I could be interrupted by a traffic update from your local BBC radio station. Or maybe you've got one of those fancy sat-navs which tells you, there may be trouble ahead. I'd face the music and dance, but Catherine Esmat emailed from Winchester with a radical proposal.
I'd like to make a point about travel news on Radio 2. I think it may be time to sort of start phasing it out because there are at least 3 other ways of getting local travel news while you're driving. One, of course, is local radio stations. Another way is on the website, obviously, before you leave. And nowadays, sat-nav systems provide live travel and traffic updates as well. And although I really like the personalities and I enjoy the banter that they have with the main radio presenters, I just think that with modern technology able to deliver much more comprehensive, much more localised travel news, it may be time to think about phasing it out.
Thank you, Catherine. Sally Bozeman, or Sally Traffic as she's better known, has been keeping Radio 2 listeners from ending up in traffic jams since 1999, with regular updates into the network's afternoon shows. I dropped in to see her in action during Steve Wright's show and asked her first how the job had changed since those early days.
We didn't have cameras or maps, or Google Maps didn't exist in those days, and so it was all looking up things in atlases very quickly and just finding out where places were. But of course with the internet you can look at stuff very easily, like this is a map page. You can zoom in on pages, you can zoom out, you can press a little button which will show you where all the traffic is, if there is traffic to be seen.
So whose cameras are these?
These cameras are run and operated by the Highways Agency, who have a camera system obviously clearly across the whole country.
Do you encourage the listeners, because, you know, the BBC is sort of obsessed with getting listener involvement, are they really necessary now to give you the information?
Yes, they are, because they're there when it happens. An accident can happen. It can be a total disaster for 1 hour, possibly 2 hours, possibly 10 minutes. And actually, knowing when that's finished is a very difficult thing to discover. Harvey's dad rang. He says it's really busy both ways, but it's going to be worse, as I say, leaving the hull.
Somebody wrote to us, Catherine Esmond from Winchester. She said, I think there, i.e. your reports, have become surplus to requirements. Local radio is the place for local traffic news. Let's phase out traffic news on Radio 2. So are you surplus to requirements?
Of course we're not. Local traffic news is lovely and wonderful, but it's no use if you're a driver and you're in Scotland and you're in Glasgow and you're just about to get in to come down to Shap on the M6. And so many hours and therefore so much money is lost every year because of professional drivers, hauliers in particular, being stuck in traffic. So local traffic can do great stuff, but it doesn't help people who are driving long distances.
And how about the truckers themselves? Do you have some affection for them?
I love my truckers. And I meet them at things like truck festivals all over the country, and we bond and I see their cabs. The A491 has been closed southbound at a place called Bell End, which is on the way to the M5 at Junction 4.
But hold on, if you've got a smartphone now, you can get all sort of apps that will tell you exactly, you know, the problems on the roads. You don't need you just check the app and there you are.
Have you ever tried checking an app while you're driving? It takes about 3 or 4 minutes to load up. But then you have to put in other information to say where you are, where you're going. And honestly, often those things are slightly behind real time. When I go on and I say something now, it's real, it's in real time, it's happening now, and it's relevant. Whereas I think to actually stop and check something on your phone may not be a very good idea.
I'm getting a little nervous now because I've been talking to you for a few minutes here. When are you next on? It's now, you know, the last time I heard you was just before 4 o'clock. It's now about 12 minutes past 4. When are you on?
I'm on. It's a bit of a movable feast, this, because it's in the middle of the Steve Wright show and he gets a little bit carried away. But it's probably about 25 past in about 10 minutes' time. So can I get on and just see what's going on?
I think we'll allow you to get back to work, yeah.
I'm just going to listen to all my messages to find out exactly what is going on.
Hello, this is Sherry. I've just gone past the accident on the M1 northbound. It's just south of the Shelf Services, just north after the A38 junction, and there was hardly anybody on the scene, so it's just happened. All right, hope that's some help. Bye.
Thank you, Sherry.
End of messages.
Back to junction 27, although it's all cleared up nicely.
Everything is all listened to, and it matters, yeah?
Everything is listened to, everything matters, everything is checked. I get quite offended when people say it isn't important, because I've always tried to do it in a way that it is important and that it saves people time, money, angst, exhaustion, all those awful things you feel when you're stuck. I try and do that. And in my head, the traffic news is as vital a public service as the sport, as the finance, as the weather. Unfortunately, historically, it hasn't always been done terribly well, so it's become a bit of a laughingstock. But if you do it properly and intelligently, which is what I try to do, then I think it is important. It does help people. And I always say, you always find traffic news really boring until you're stuck in a jam. And then it's really, really important. Hang on a second. Adam, is this the last record before I'm on? Right. M6 northbound, 1 lane closed, 37 to 6.
Studio's about 25 feet away, yeah?
You're panicking.
How long does it take you? About 10 seconds to get across there, yeah? But you've got to be able to breathe when you're in the studio. There's no point running, is there?
You're panicking on my behalf. You're going to get me nervous in a minute.
I'll be doing that when I was doing
This is proper broadcasting, mate.
This is proper broadcasting.
Proper broadcasting.
One day I'll know.
So if you guys would like to just sit here...
Yeah, we'll stay.
I've got 4:26 now on The Big Show. It's Steve Wright in the afternoon, and here she comes, the goddess of traffic. BBC Radio 2. It is Sally Traffic.
The high wind warning signs are up for...
So you can keep your emails coming into Sally for some time yet. And, of course, I'm always happy to hear from you about anything you've heard on BBC Radio lately, whether it irritates or educates or just gives pleasure. OK, Sally, I've got a piece of paper here, and we'd be really, really grateful if you just read what's on it.
There's extra money involved for this, but you can write to feedback at P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard line charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website.
This is Radio 2 with your traffic news.
So don't just shout at the radio, tell me about it. Or perhaps you prefer to shout on the radio, or indeed argue on the radio, or even cry on the radio. Numerous listeners take directly to the airwaves every week on BBC phone-ins, where they can make themselves heard by millions, often including some very important people.
Morning, it's 10 o'clock on Tuesday. Victoria Derbyshire with you on 5 Live with the latest news, sport and interviews between now and noon. Yep, the Labour leader Ed Miliband will be here after 11 o'clock to answer your questions. So here's the number to ring.
And they did call, and the Labour leader didn't get an easy time of it.
I think it's quite clear to everybody, you're not going to be the Prime Minister of this country by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I will put my life on that. That is not going to happen. And if Labour are going to win an election, it'll be with somebody else.
Look, Charles, we'll have to agree to disagree.
From Radio 4's Any Answers to Radio 5 Live's Your Call, when it comes to phone-ins, listener Alistair Ferguson is a fan.
Phone-ins tend to get to the nitty-gritty of issues that are topical or that affect people's lives. It can bring out very emotive talking. It can bring out some deep-rooted issues. It is, in fact, real life.
Victoria Derbyshire hears real-life stories every weekday on her 5 Live show.
The kind of listeners that we want on my particular programme are listeners who might happen to be an eyewitness in the centre of a news story, or listeners with an absolutely pertinent experience to an issue in the news. For example, if you're talking about squeezed living standards, listeners with experience of those areas are absolutely relevant to the discussion.
But it's real people who put off listeners like Howard Bradfield.
I'd much prefer to listen to a discussion between, say, a professional expert or in a sort of Today-style format, rather than a sort of self-selecting and emotion-driven call-in where people just need to get something off their chest.
This is the Stephen Nolan Show, where the people have the power.
Stuart, I'm only interrupting you.
Guardian journalists,
okay.
bourgeois liberals, and radio commentators take home every week.
All right, Stuart, listen to me.
£600 a week.
Stuart.
No,
but listen to me.
Hyperventilating egotists, or the listener at the heart of the headlines. Stephen Nolan will take the lot. He presents 8 phone-in programmes a week, 5 on BBC Northern Ireland and 3 on 5 Live, and says the best radio is a combination of ordinary listener and expert opinion.
It's a mixture, isn't it? And I want expert opinion on my phone-ins because it informs you and it educates you. However, I would argue very strongly that the man in the street, the man with the real-life experience, can educate some of the experts. And that man in the street, by the way, has as much right to be heard, has as much right to have the power of a BBC platform as any expert. What's wrong with someone that just has a really strong opinion?
My name's Karen Williams, and I really try to avoid phone-in programmes because usually the arguments are simplistic and biased and ill-informed. Often somebody with extreme views will make for maybe a more entertaining programme, but in actual fact, for me, it's very irritating.
Irritating or not, the presenters insist it's worth it, as it may be one of the few occasions when a politician, for example, gets to hear those extreme views straight from the horse's mouth.
It is one of the most vital ingredients in the BBC, and I would go that far, enabling an ordinary person to have access to the very top of government. A family has just phoned me to tell me that their 86-year-old mother was left in an accident and emergency ward with a suspected stroke. The health minister was apologising within minutes. The head of that hospital was in this radio studio within hours. It just really irks me that anybody questions the validity of a good phone-in show.
Feedback listener Tom Lyons doesn't. He cites an exchange between listeners and Edwina Curry on a Stephen Nolan phone-in about poverty in the UK.
Their money doesn't run to food if they're paying for heating.
Are you telling me people in this country are going hungry?
Absolutely.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Seriously? Do you know, I really have great difficulty believing that.
My name is Tom Lyons. I live in Brighton. She simply said there are not people in this country who are short of food. And then a lot of people phoned in and said, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. This is my situation, or this is a situation of someone I know, or this is a situation which I'm close to. Now, that was extremely useful, I thought, as part of the general information about what's going on in this country, because you do not hear that normally from the mainstream media.
Victoria Derbyshire believes those direct exchanges may even encourage politicians to rethink their policies.
For example, the government's plans to introduce the 50% sentence discount, which they were happily, it seemed, going forward with until the Justice Secretary came on my programme and listeners told him in no uncertain terms this was a really bad idea.
A victim of crime is not just a victim of that crime. It has a knock-on effect on family, on employment, on the economy.
Can I ask you what you think of Ken Clarke? I'm not saying because those listeners told Ken Clarke that day they ditched the policy, but it certainly contributed to the debate.
Do you think, Victoria, it's a tougher gig for politicians coming on a show when they do come on a show like yours, that the audience can ask questions more directly than you would?
Definitely. And a
they?
listener can give them a really personal, specific example about a policy that this politician has introduced that is affecting their lives, perhaps in a detrimental way, and perhaps in a way that a politician never imagined would happen when they introduced that policy. And that really puts that politician on the spot.
Thanks, Victoria. And that's all from this edition of Feedback, where we try and put BBC politicians on the spot. Next week, Glasswatch returns for 1 week only, when Philip Glass tells us what he thinks of the incessant use of his compositions to spice up BBC dramas. And I'll be talking to Today presenter Justin Webb about the art of the interview. It's about time I learned. I hope you'll help me with some good questions. Call me. Go on.
Distressing.
This is a news programme, and much of the news is distressing. If it's that bad, don't broadcast it.
Our correspondent Paul Wood has been speaking to a group of refugees from Homs. You may find his report distressing.
My name is Constantine Pagonis, and I live in Western Colville, near Cambridge. Why a warning at all? What are the reasons behind it? Is it to ensure that people who do not want to be distressed have a chance to turn the radio off? Or is it to give parents a chance to shield children from such reports?
They endured weeks under bombardment, then fled, panicked, before troops arrived.
I would be very interested to understand the advice, legal or otherwise, which underpins this policy. Perhaps a more sensible approach would be simply to recognise that news reports, unfortunately, often contain material that is both distressing for adults and inappropriate for children.
I went to see Richard Clarke, the editor of This Is a Download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Now, speak for England, Evan, and Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales as well.
Now, it may not feel that super for you, but it's Super Tuesday today, the day that 10 US states hold their Republican primaries or caucuses. Jim Naughtie is over in Washington and set out to me earlier what we should be looking out for.
It is a big day.
Well, a big day for him, but in Feedback this week, I'll ask the editor of the BBC Radio Newsroom why he thinks you need to hear so much about the American primaries when the story never changes. Romney's in the lead, but can't clinch the deal. And one Feedback listener thinks Radio 2 should park its travel updates, but Sally Traffic says she hasn't reached the end of the road yet.
The traffic news is as vital a public service as the sport, as the finance, as the weather. And I always say you always find traffic news really boring until you're stuck in a jam.
Don't worry, there are no more excruciating puns to come. A vehicle for over-emotional ranters or a hotline to real life in Britain today. I put listeners' views on the ubiquitous phone-in to 5 Live presenters Victoria Derbyshire and Stephen Nolan. But first, how much detail do you need to hear when it comes to news reports about the atrocities of war or a particularly brutal murder? Opinion among feedback listeners is sharply divided. Take last week's reporting of the horrific events leading up to the death of 15-year-old Christy Bambu, whose sister and her partner believed was a witch. Godfrey Holmes from Chesterfield was one of a number of listeners who thought there was too much detail, especially